双语音标领航，注音阅读启蒙，叶兴阳有声读物。
A Second Home by Honoré de Balzac. Translated by Clara Bell. Dedication. To Madame la Comtesse Louise de Turckheim as a token of remembrance and affectionate respect. A Second Home. The Rue du Tourniquet Saint-Jean. Formerly one of the darkest and most tortuous of the streets about the Hôtel de Ville, zigzagged round the little gardens of the Paris prefecture, and ended at the Rue Martroi, exactly at the angle of an old wall now pulled down. Here stood the turnstile to which the street owed its name. It was not removed till 1823, when the municipality built a ballroom on the garden plot adjoining the Hôtel de Ville, for the fête given in honor of the Duc d'Angoulême on his return from Spain. The widest part of the Rue du Tourniquet was the end opening into the Rue de la Tixeranderie, and even there it was less than 6 feet across. Hence, in rainy weather the gutter water was soon deep at the foot of the old houses, sweeping down with it the dust and refuse deposited at the cornerstones by the residents. As the dust carts could not pass through, the inhabitants trusted to storms to wash their always miry alley. For how could it be clean, when the summer sun shed its perpendicular rays on Paris like a sheet of gold, but as piercing as the point of a sword? It lighted up the blackness of this street for a few minutes without drying the permanent damp that rose from the ground floor to the first story of these dark and silent tenements. The residents, who lighted their lamps at 5 o'clock in the month of June, in winter never put them out. To this day the enterprising wayfarer who should approach the Marais along the quays, past the end of the Rue du Chaume,
the Rue de l'Homme Arme, des Billettes,
and de Duports, all leading to the Rue du Tourniquet, might think he had passed through cellars all the way. Almost all the streets of old Paris, of which ancient chronicles laud the magnificence, were like this damp and gloomy labyrinth, where the antiquaries still find historical curiosities to admire. For instance, on the house then forming the corner where the Rue du Tourniquet joined the Rue de la Tixeranderie, the clamps might still be seen of 2 strong iron rings fixed to the wall, the relics of the chains put up every night by the watch to secure public safety. This house, remarkable for its antiquity, had been constructed in a way that bore witness to the unhealthiness of these old dwellings. For, to preserve the ground floor from damp, the arches of the cellars rose about 2 feet above the soil, and the house was entered up 3 outside steps. The door was crowned by a closed arch, of which the keystone bore a female head and some time-eaten arabesques. 3 windows, their sills about 5 feet from the ground, belonged to a small set of rooms looking out on the Rue du Tourniquet, whence they derived their light. These windows were protected by strong iron bars, very wide apart, and ending below in an outward curve like the bars of a baker's window. If any passerby during the day were curious enough to peep into the 2 rooms forming this little dwelling, he could see nothing, for only under the sun of July could he discern, in the second room, 2 beds hung with green serge, placed side by side under the paneling of an old-fashioned alcove. But in the afternoon, by about 3 o'clock, when the candles were lighted, through the pane of the first room an old woman might be seen sitting on a stool by the fireplace, where she nursed the fire in a brazier, to simmer a stew, such as porters' wives are expert in. A few kitchen utensils, hung up against the wall, were visible in the twilight. At that hour an old table on trestles, but bare of linen, was laid with pewter spoons, and the dish concocted by the old woman. 3 wretched chairs were all the furniture of this room, which was at once the kitchen and the dining room. Over the chimney-piece were a piece of looking-glass, a tinder-box, 3 glasses, some matches, and a large, cracked white jug. Still, the floor, the utensils, the fireplace, all gave a pleasant sense of the perfect cleanliness and thrift that pervaded the dull and gloomy home. The old woman's pale, withered face was quite in harmony with the darkness of the street and the mustiness of the place. As she sat there, motionless, in her chair, it might have been thought that she was as inseparable from the house as a snail from its brown shell. Her face, alert with a vague expression of mischief, was framed in a flat cap made of net, which barely covered her white hair. Her fine, gray eyes were as quiet as the street, and the many wrinkles in her face might be compared to the cracks in the walls. Whether she had been born to poverty, or had fallen from some past splendor, she now seemed to have been long resigned to her melancholy existence, from sunrise till dark, excepting when she was getting a meal ready, or, with a basket on her arm, was out purchasing provisions. The old woman sat in the adjoining room by the further window, opposite a young girl. At any hour of the day the passer-by could see the needlewoman seated in an old, red velvet chair, bending over an embroidery frame, and stitching indefatigably. Her mother had a green pillow on her knee, and busied herself with handmade net, but her fingers could move the bobbin but slowly. Her sight was feeble, for on her nose there rested a pair of those antiquated spectacles which keep their place on the nostrils by the grip of a spring. By night these two hard-working women set a lamp between them, and the light, concentrated by two globe-shaped bottles of water, showed the elder the fine network made by the threads on her pillow, and the younger the most delicate details of the pattern she was embroidering. The outward bend of the window had allowed the girl to rest a box of earth on the window-sill, in which grew some sweet peas, nasturtiums, a sickly little honeysuckle, and some convolvulus that twined its frail stems up the iron bars. These etiolated plants produced a few pale flowers, and added a touch of indescribable sadness and sweetness to the picture offered by this window, in which the two figures were appropriately framed. The most selfish soul who chanced to see this domestic scene would carry away with him a perfect image of the life led in Paris by the working class of women, for the embroideress evidently lived by her needle. Many, as they passed through the turnstile, found themselves wondering how a girl could preserve her color, living in such a cellar. A student of lively imagination, going that way to cross to the Quartier Latin, would compare this obscure and vegetative life to that of the ivy that clung to these chill walls, to that of the peasants born to labor, who are born,
toil,
and die unknown to the world they have helped to feed. A house owner, after studying the house with the eye of a valuer, would have said, "What will become of those two women if embroidery should go out of fashion?" Among the men who, having some appointment at the Hôtel de Ville or the Palais de Justice, were obliged to go through this street at fixed hours, either on their way to business or on their return home, there may have been some charitable soul, some widower or Adonis of 40, brought so often into the secrets of these sad lives, may perhaps have reckoned on the poverty of this mother and daughter, and have hoped to become the master at no great cost of the innocent workwoman, whose nimble and dimpled fingers, youthful figure, and white skin charm due, no doubt, to living in this sunless street had excited his admiration. Perhaps, again, some honest clerk, with 1,200 francs a year, seeing every day the diligence the girl gave to her needle, and appreciating the purity of her life, was only waiting for improved prospects to unite one humble life with another, one form of toil to another, and to bring at any rate a man's arm and a calm affection, pale-hued like the flowers in the window, to uphold this home. Vague hope certainly gave life to the mother's dim, gray eyes. Every morning, after the most frugal breakfast, she took up her pillow, though chiefly for the look of the thing, for she would lay her spectacles on a little mahogany work-table as old as herself, and look out of the window from about 8:30 till 10 at the regular passers in the street. She caught their glances, remarked on their gait, their dress, their countenance, and almost seemed to be offering her daughter. Her gossiping eyes so evidently tried to attract some magnetic sympathy by maneuvers worthy of the stage. It was evident that this little review was as good as a play to her, and perhaps her single amusement. The daughter rarely looked up. Modesty, or a painful consciousness of poverty, seemed to keep her eyes riveted to the work frame, and only some exclamation of surprise from her mother moved her to show her small features. Then a clerk in a new coat, or who unexpectedly appeared with a woman on his arm, might catch sight of the girl's slightly upturned nose, her rosy mouth, and gray eyes, always bright and lively in spite of her fatiguing toil. Her late hours had left a trace on her face by a pale circle marked under each eye on the fresh rosiness of her cheeks. The poor child looked as if she were made for love and cheerfulness for love, which had drawn two perfect arches above her eyelids, and had given her such a mass of chestnut hair that she might have hidden under it as under a tent, impenetrable to the lover's eye for cheerfulness, which gave quivering animation to her nostrils, which carved two dimples in her rosy cheeks, and made her quick to forget her troubles. Cheerfulness, the blossom of hope, which gave her strength to look out without shuddering on the barren path of life. The girl's hair was always carefully dressed, after the manner of Paris needlewomen. Her toilet seemed to her quite complete when she had brushed her hair smooth and tucked up the little short curls that played on each temple in contrast with the whiteness of her skin. The growth of it on the back of her neck was so pretty, and the brown line, so clearly traced, gave such a pleasing idea of her youth and charm, that the observer, seeing her bent over her work, and unmoved by any sound, was inclined to think of her as a coquette. Such inviting promise had excited the interest of more than one young man, who turned round in the vain hope of seeing that modest countenance. "Caroline, there is a new face that passes regularly by, and not one of the old ones to compare with it." These words, spoken in a low voice by her mother one August morning in 1815, had vanquished the young needlewoman's indifference, and she looked out on the street, but in vain. The stranger was gone. "Where has he flown to?" said she. "He will come back no doubt at 4. I shall see him coming, and will touch your foot with mine. I am sure he will come back. He has been through the street regularly for the last 3 days. But his hours vary. The first day he came by at 6 o'clock. The day before yesterday it was 4. Yesterday as early as 3. I remember seeing him occasionally some time ago. He is some clerk in the prefect's office who has moved to the Marais." "Why?" she exclaimed, after glancing down the street. "Our gentleman of the brown coat has taken to wearing a wig. How much it alters him." The gentleman of the brown coat was, it would seem, the individual who commonly closed the daily procession, for the old woman put on her spectacles and took up her work with a sigh, glancing at her daughter with so strange a look that Lavater himself would have found it difficult to interpret. Admiration, gratitude, a sort of hope for better days, were mingled with pride at having such a pretty daughter. At about 4 in the afternoon the old lady pushed her foot against Caroline's, and the girl looked up quickly enough to see the new actor, whose regular advent would thenceforth lend variety to the scene. He was tall and thin, and wore black, a man of about 40, with a certain solemnity of demeanor. As his piercing hazel eye met the old woman's dull gaze, he made her quake, for she felt as though he had the gift of reading hearts, or much practice in it, and his presence must surely be as icy as the air of this dank street. Was the dull, sallow complexion of that ominous face due to excess of work, or the result of delicate health? The old woman supplied 20 different answers to this question, but Caroline, next day, discerned the lines of long mental suffering on that brow that was so prompt to frown. The rather hollow cheeks of the unknown bore the stamp of the seal which sorrow sets on its victims, as if to grant them the consolation of common recognition and brotherly union for resistance. Though the girl's expression was at first one of lively but innocent curiosity, it assumed a look of gentle sympathy as the stranger receded from view, like a last relation following in a funeral train. The heat of the weather was so great, and the gentleman was so absent-minded, that he had taken off his hat and forgotten to put it on again as he went down the squalid street. Caroline could see the stern look given to his countenance by the way the hair was brushed from his forehead. The strong impression, devoid of charm, made on the girl by this man's appearance was totally unlike any sensation produced by the other passengers who used the street. For the first time in her life, she was moved to pity for someone else than herself and her mother. She made no reply to the absurd conjectures that supplied material for the old woman's provoking volubility, and drew her long needle in silence through the web of stretched net. She only regretted not having seen the stranger more closely, and looked forward to the morrow to form a definite opinion of him. It was the first time, indeed, that a man passing down the street had ever given rise to much thought in her mind. She generally had nothing but a smile in response to her mother's hypotheses, for the old woman looked on every passer-by as a possible protector for her daughter, and if such suggestions, so crudely presented, gave rise to no evil thoughts in Caroline's mind, her indifference must be ascribed to the persistent and unfortunately inevitable toil in which the energies of her sweet youth were being spent, and which would infallibly mar the clearness of her eyes or steal from her fresh cheeks the bloom that still colored them. For 2 months or more the black gentleman, the name they had given him, was erratic in his movements. He did not always come down the Rue du Tourniquet. The old woman sometimes saw him in the evening when he had not passed in the morning, and he did not come by at such regular hours as the clerks who served Madame Crochard instead of a clock. Moreover, excepting on the first occasion, when his look had given the old mother a sense of alarm, his eyes had never once dwelt on the weird picture of these 2 female gnomes. With the exception of 2 carriage gates and a dark ironmonger's shop, there were in the Rue du Tourniquet only barred windows, giving light to the staircases of the neighboring houses. Thus the stranger's lack of curiosity was not to be accounted for by the presence of dangerous rivals, and Madame Crochard was greatly piqued to see her black gentleman, always lost in thought, his eyes fixed on the ground, or straight before him, as though he hoped to read the future in the fog of the Rue du Tourniquet. However, one morning, about the middle of September, Caroline Crochard's roguish face stood out so brightly against the dark background of the room, looking so fresh among the belated flowers and faded leaves that twined round the window bars. The daily scene was gay with such contrasts of light and shade, of pink and white blending with the light material on which the pretty needlewoman was working, and with the red and brown hues of the chairs, that the stranger gazed very attentively at the effects of this living picture. In point of fact, the old woman, provoked by her black gentleman's indifference, had made such a clatter with her bobbins that the gloomy and pensive passer-by was perhaps prompted to look up by the unusual noise. The stranger merely exchanged glances with Caroline, swift indeed, but enough to effect a certain contact between their souls, and both were aware that they would think of each other. When the stranger came by again, at 4 in the afternoon, Caroline recognized the sound of his step on the echoing pavement. They looked steadily at each other, and with evident purpose. His eyes had an expression of kindliness which made him smile, and Caroline colored. The old mother noted them with satisfaction. Ever after that memorable afternoon, the gentleman in black went by twice a day, with rare exceptions, which both the women observed. They concluded from the irregularity of the hours of his homecoming that he was not released so early, nor so precisely punctual as a subordinate official. All through the first 3 winter months, twice a day, Caroline and the stranger thus saw each other for so long as it took him to traverse the piece of road that lay along the length of the door and 3 windows of the house. Day after day this brief interview had the hue of friendly sympathy which at last had acquired a sort of fraternal kindness. Caroline and the stranger seemed to understand each other from the first, and then, by dint of scrutinizing each other's faces, they learned to know them well. Ere long it came to be, as it were, a visit that the unknown owed to Caroline. If by any chance her gentleman in black went by without bestowing on her the half-smile of his expressive lips, or the cordial glance of his brown eyes, something was missing to her all day. She felt as an old man does to whom the daily study of a newspaper is such an indispensable pleasure that on the day after any great holiday he wanders about quite lost, and seeking, as much out of vagueness as for want of patience, the sheet by which he cheats an hour of life. But these brief meetings had the charm of intimate friendliness, quite as much for the stranger as for Caroline. The girl could no more hide a vexation, a grief, or some slight ailment from the keen eye of her appreciative friend than he could conceal anxiety from hers. He must have had some trouble yesterday, was the thought that constantly arose in the embroideress mind as she saw some change in the features of the black gentleman.
Oh,
He has been working too hard, was a reflection due to another shade of expression which Caroline could discern. The stranger, on his part, could guess when the girl had spent Sunday in finishing a dress, and he felt an interest in the pattern. As quarter day came near, he could see that her pretty face was clouded by anxiety, and he could guess when Caroline had sat up late at work. But above all, he noted how the gloomy thoughts that dimmed the cheerful and delicate features of her young face gradually vanished by degrees as their acquaintance ripened. When winter had killed the climbers and plants of her window garden, and the window was kept closed, it was not without a smile of gentle amusement that the stranger observed the concentration of the light within, just at the level of Caroline's head. The very small fire and the frosty red of the two women's faces betrayed the poverty of their home. But if ever his own countenance expressed regretful compassion, the girl proudly met it with assumed cheerfulness. Meanwhile, the feelings that had arisen in their hearts remained buried there, no incident occurring to reveal to either of them how deep and strong they were in the other. They had never even heard the sound of each other's voice. These mute friends were even on their guard against any nearer acquaintance, as though it meant disaster. Each seemed to fear lest it should bring on the other some grief more serious than those they felt tempted to share. Was it shyness or friendship that checked them? Was it a dread of meeting with selfishness, or the odious distrust which sunders all the residents within the walls of a populous city? Did the voice of conscience warn them of approaching danger? It would be impossible to explain the instinct which made them as much enemies as friends, at once indifferent and attached, drawn to each other by impulse, and severed by circumstance. Each perhaps hoped to preserve a cherished illusion. It might almost have been thought that the stranger feared lest he should hear some vulgar word from those lips as fresh and pure as a flower, and that Caroline felt herself unworthy of the mysterious personage who was evidently possessed of power and wealth. As to Madame Crochard, that tender mother, almost angry at her daughter's persistent lack of decisiveness, now showed a sulky face to the black gentleman, on whom she had hitherto smiled with a sort of benevolent servility. Never before had she complained so bitterly of being compelled, at her age, to do the cooking. Never had her catarrh and her rheumatism wrung so many groans from her. Finally, she could not, this winter, promise so many ells of net as Caroline had hitherto been able to count on. Under these circumstances, and towards the end of December, at the time when bread was dearest, and that dearth of corn was beginning to be felt which made the year 1816 so hard on the poor, the stranger observed on the features of the girl whose name was still unknown to him the painful traces of a secret sorrow which his kindest smiles could not dispel. Before long he saw in Caroline's eyes the dimness attributed to long hours at night. One night, towards the end of the month, the gentleman in black passed down the Rue du Tourniquet at the quite unwonted hour of 1 in the morning. The perfect silence allowed of his hearing before passing the house the lachrymose voice of the old mother, and Caroline's even sadder tones, mingling with the swish of a shower of sleet. He crept along as slowly as he could, and then, at the risk of being taken up by the police, he stood still below the window to hear the mother and daughter, while watching them through the largest of the holes in the yellow muslin curtains, which were eaten away by where as a cabbage leaf is riddled by caterpillars. The inquisitive stranger saw a sheet of paper on the table that stood between the two work frames, and on which stood the lamp and the globes filled with water. He at once identified it as a writ. Madame Crochard was weeping, and Caroline's voice was thick, and had lost its sweet, caressing tone. "Why be so heartbroken, mother? Monsieur Molyneux will not sell us up or turn us out before I have finished this dress. Only 2 nights more, and I shall take it home to Madame Rogwin. And supposing she keeps you waiting as usual? And will the money for the gown pay the baker too? The spectator of this scene had long practice in reading faces. He fancied he could discern that the mother's grief was as false as the daughter's was genuine. He turned away, and presently came back. When he next peeped through the hole in the curtain, Madame Crochard was in bed. The young needlewoman, bending over her frame, was embroidering with indefatigable diligence. On the table, with the writ lay a triangular hunch of bread, placed there, no doubt, to sustain her in the night and to remind her of the reward of her industry. The stranger was tremulous with pity and sympathy. He threw his purse in through a cracked pane so that it should fall at the girl's feet. And then, without waiting to enjoy her surprise, he escaped, his cheeks tingling. Next morning the shy and melancholy stranger went past with a look of deep preoccupation. But he could not escape Caroline's gratitude. She had opened her window and affected to be digging in the square window box buried in snow. A pretext of which the clumsy ingenuity plainly told her benefactor that she had been resolved not to see him only through the pane. Her eyes were full of tears as she bowed her head, as much as to say to her benefactor, "I can only repay you from my heart." But the gentleman in black affected not to understand the meaning of this sincere gratitude. In the evening, as he came by, Caroline was busy mending the window with a sheet of paper, and she smiled at him, showing her row of pearly teeth like a promise. Thenceforth the stranger went another way, and was no more seen in the Rue du Tourniquet. It was one day early in the following May that, as Caroline was giving the roots of the honeysuckle a glass of water,